You can pretend that you're not interested in politics, but let me tell you, politics is interested in you.
That you're taking an entire race of people or a country of people and booting them out of your country. I don't know. I see no positive way under which this can resolve itself.
When you're dealing with a religion that can't be reformed, when you're dealing with a religion that has a text that's immutable, right? Quran's not written, it's uncreated, it just is. When you're dealing with all that.
Howdy, I'm Hannah Newich-Schwander, a production lead at a soybean seed facility in Central Illinois, and you're listening to the Vance Crowe podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today, Chris Bennett returns to the podcast. We're going to talk about his past, which is mysterious and shrouded. I have actually no idea where this guy came from, even though he's been on the podcast a bunch. Then we're going to talk about some of the big issues going on in the world today. One of the things I always rely on for Chris is a cold, objective look at the way the government is interacting with its people, particularly in rural America. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But first, you may have noticed that over the last week or so, I've started posting videos that describe some communications lessons, some ways to describe yourself as an introduction, ways to get through conflict, ways to negotiate. This has been done as a part of something I'm working on in a much bigger picture, which is to continue the public speaking that I do, to travel around the country to attend conferences and meetings where I can help people get better at negotiating through conflict with some of their loved ones or employees, thinking about succession planning and the need to get stories told about your family members. How do you get them to open up? How do you get them to share who they are and what they care about? If you're interested in having me attend one of your events to give a talk or potentially put on a workshop, go to vancecrowe.com to find out more. There's a contact page there, and you can always just write me a quick note about your event, and we can schedule a call to see if I'm a good fit for it. Otherwise, just enjoy those shorts. They've been a labor of love, and I think hopefully one day we'll put them all together in a single class. All right, without further ado, let's head to the interview with my man, Chris Bennett. Chris Bennett, welcome to the podcast.
Vance, great to see you, great to talk to you. It's an absolute privilege to be on here. You keep your hands on your head because, like always, I'm going to try and steal a few IQ points from you if I can.
Well, man, we were talking before this podcast got started. You've been one of the all-time favorite guests of mine, of the audience. But I actually don't have any idea where you came from, where you got this thick Southern drawl from, and who the heck you are. So I thought I'd start off there today. Who is this man shrouded in mystery, Chris Bennett?
Hey, Vance, well, we're all somewhat a product of our past, at least a little bit. And when I was in the early 1970s, my parents were missionaries. My father was a pastor in southeast Arkansas. When I was a little kid, we moved to Jordan. We were supposed to go to Lebanon, stop period temporarily in Jordan. This was in the early 1970s. This was right after the 67 war, the big one with Israel, of course, and it was in the midst of pretty much constant turmoil. So the place was relatively primitive at the time. We lived in Amman, the capital, but we lived out in the middle of nowhere. We had a house. It was on stone blocks, or indeed made of stone blocks. It sat by itself, and there were shepherds and sheep, goats that came through constantly. The fellas in robes and the women in the black and the tents and so on. And we had access. I had a brother, I had an older brother, and we had access to literally behind the house. It went on forever and ever. Almost on a really clear day in spots, you could see through the valleys pretty much, all the way to Israel. Some spots not far away, you could see, the towers of Jerusalem and so on. So it was a wonderful place as a little kid to spend some time. We went back and forth from there to Arkansas, back and forth. And I distinctly remember that as a little boy, right down the hill from us, there was a family living there of Bedouin, and the daddy of the group had 4 wives. They had them set up in little cinder block huts, each one. I believe it was the cinder blocks with maybe 10 on the roof, and the kids ran around, and I played with him. And one day, he came flying by our house. He had his robe, his dress pulled up to his groin almost, where you could see the whites of his thighs, and he was running lickety-split across stones and thorns, barefoot, of course. They were all barefoot. And he was booking, and right behind him, 20, 30 yards, came a pack of men. They were cussing and screaming. They had stones, baseball to softball size, and they were throwing them. They looked like they would mean to kill him. And they did. We saw him cut across the field, and he got away from them. And what he'd done, Vance, was he had done something, I don't remember, to one of those wives, and her family had come for him to take his head. They got it all settled, and I don't want to act like that were something normal that I saw every day, but that certainly was part of the milieu of what was going on. You know, it was a desert area, at least very dry at the time. At the time, early 70s, very primitive, so we didn't have any water. We got water, I think, maybe once a month. They would come fill up a little tank on top of the house. It was a metal tank, and that was it. And when you ran out, you ran out. And I remember driving with my daddy to bribe an official or a truck guy. You stopped and pay them cash and see if they could give you some water and make it again for the rest of the month. Interesting stuff. But anyway, that's a little bit of the background there.
And how long were you out there living like that?
Oh, it was like that for, I'd say, 7, 8 years. Like I said, we weren't there the whole time. We stayed 3 or 4 years and come back. But it was pretty much like that. And then Jordan had the advantage of catching the good winds of war. And every time there was a conflict, Lord, there was a conflict every 2 to 3 years. There was usually an influx of money, an influx of circumstance, an influx of Western government favor. And so the country was able to build itself up. And by the time you get into the 1980s, things had changed and they had begun to modernize. I remember back in somewhere around the early 80s, I was playing on the soccer team, and I wasn't any good. Don't get me wrong. It's not my point. In fact, I think I was probably the last man on a 15-man squad to make the team, which is something relishing, something very satisfactory about being 15 of 15. I don't know why. It's coming last in your class at West Point. There's a degree of bravado. Anyway, sorry. So I was playing on the soccer team, and we were going to play a tournament in Dubai. And Dubai at the time was just a bunch of sand itself. Certainly there were no tall buildings, anything like that. And to get there, to put it basically, you had to fly over the Persian Gulf. And the Persian Gulf at the time was terrorist central. If you wanted to be hijacked, keep flying over the Persian Gulf. I mean, you get on a plane, you sit in armed or unarmed, that kind of thing. So anyway, we went to Dubai and got our tails just kicked. I remember after the tournament, the coach told us how bad we were, how traumatizing it was for me to hear that from him. And then later in life, it became one of the funniest moments of life. But anyhow, on the way back, flight back over the Persian Gulf, again, there was 15 kids. Coach, I don't know where he went. He was on the plane, but he went somewhere else, more than likely to get drunk, drinking. So he wasn't sitting with us. There were 15 of us in our church shoes, some sort of dress slacks, and, blazers that didn't fit, that you could tell were gotten from an older brother or off the rack at some unfortunate store. And so somebody, it was a big plane, 3 or 4 seats on the sides, 5, 6 in the middle, giant plane, packed. I mean, there was a team that beat us from Cairo in the back. We were somewhat in the middle. Then up in front of us was a bunch of Filipino ladies, must have been workers. And then you got a mix of Arabs, and it was just looked like someone shook up a canister of jelly beans. So midway through the flight over the Persian Gulf, one of my buddies pulls out this cylinder from his pocket, and the cylinder has another cylinder within, and it has a yellow liquid. And so I knew what it was. We all knew it was a stink bomb. And so I said, hey, y'all, listen, we got to take that stink bomb. We got to take it back to the back by the Cairo team, and let's break it, and we'll get, a tiny bit of revenge on those boys that beat us. So everybody was, down for that, and two of the idiots, not me, decided, they'll act it out. They'll take it back there. I said, all right, one of y'all take it back there. Kneel down and act like you're tying your shoe. Vance, with shoes that had no laces, of course. Just act like you're tying your shoe. And then the other one, you hit it with your heel, and then y'all go into the bathroom, and this whole thing will blow over. They'll cough a little, and we'll be fine. I had no idea the effects inside a fuselage of a stink bomb. We had used these things we'd used them for years, man, at school or in stores and stuff. So anyway, they took it back there, and they broke it. And as soon as they broke it on the ground, one of them broke it with his heel, he panicked. And when they panicked, they turned around and ran back to us. 13 heads stuck in the aisle, peering down back at them, and here they come bolting toward us. And right behind them, within, I'd say 3 or 4 seconds, maybe less, but certainly 3 or 4 seconds, came an absolute smell from the pits of hell. This came roaring behind them. And instantly, all over the plane, everyone assumed, like you would, that we were under terrorist attack. And people began to wail. The Secret Service guys pulled their pistols, and they're running around. They got the little short ties on, look like they hadn't slept for 4 days, bad mustaches. All of them, at least 5 or 6, they're running around everywhere, can't figure out what's going on. There are people standing up in the aisle, standing up in their seats. The Filipinos are crying out to Jesus for mercy. The ladies are standing up, raising their hands. You got the Arab women are calling out to Allah. They're calling out things. And everybody's freaking out. People are pulling down their oxygen masks, and people are retching all over the plane. So we're laughing, right? We got our jackets pulled over our heads, and we're laughing like the devil. This goes on for at least 5 minutes. Finally, the captain or co-captain, somebody with stripes, comes back to us and says, we know what you did. We know it's you. As we'll let you know that when we land this plane, the military is going to be waiting on y'all. They're going to pick you up, and they will take you directly to prison. And the 15 of you tonight will sleep in prison. So, of course, we stopped laughing. It pretty much calmed us down 100%, got sober, found religion. And when we landed in Jordan, there was no military. There was no police. We went right through the airport. No one said a thing. Who knows, Vance? Little crazy story.
Whoa. So you got off scot-free after you went through the terror of thinking you're going to a Jordanian prison.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Which we used to call them fingernail factories, because they'd catch people, young people sometimes. And one of the common things they would do is if you did something wrong, I don't know, they got caught driving, without a license or something, they shaved people's heads. And so the story got out that they pulled the fingernails too. So they were always called the fingernail factory, but that could be true. That could not be true. There you go.
You're living there as like a minister's kid. Are you guys converting people in your house? Are you welcomed in this community? How is all this working?
Oh no, not even a modicum of that. Jordan is one of the few Arab countries that had original church charters established when the country was formed. In other words, the king allowed a couple of churches to be in existence, right? There's always been a Christian community in these countries, most of them, and most of them have a community that still survives. But to go and actually build a church was illegal at the time. So if you had a charter dating to way back when, then you were okay to have your one building or 2 buildings or whatever they allowed you. And as long as you held service within that building and did nothing else, they would leave you alone. But over the years, there were certainly people killed, often by their own families. Somebody, if you would hear, a woman might want to convert to Christ, and then 2 months later, she would fall out of a 4th-story apartment window. That wasn't, nothing unusual, nothing unheard of. And again, I hadn't been there for years, so I'm not telling you what things are like now. But the idea that Christianity would have any sort of free reign, any sort of elbow room in a Muslim country would be nothing to, I would have never have seen anything remotely of that sort.
This has to be a radically different upbringing than other kids that have your accent. Where is your accent actually from? And then how did this experience of living abroad in Jordan impact you as a kid, being way more cultured than a lot of other people you're probably around?
We would go back and forth to southeast Arkansas, which is where my mama's people were from. She was from Phillips County. My father was from the other side of the state in Clark County. So Arkansas at the time was all I knew for America. So we'd come back every 3-4 years. That was my identity. That was who I was as an American. And I'm in Mississippi now, Lord bless, and I married a Mississippi girl later on. But when I was a little boy, I guess 2 years old, 3 years old, 2, we had nowhere to go to school except Arab schools. So we went to Arab kindergarten, and they didn't have to speak no English, nothing like that. And then when my brother, who would have, he's about 3 years older than me, when he got to the point where he could go to school, he couldn't go to the school we were in. We had to go somewhere else, and there was a school that was in English, and we switched over to that one. And that's where I spent for the next, oh man, I don't even know, Vance, 9-10 years. And my heart, my identity was 100% always back here in the South. That's just the way we were raised. And I only knew Phillips County, Arkansas, and I only knew agriculture. That's about all I knew in America.
Did you feel like you were missing out? Like you had to go to Jordan and you didn't want to? You wanted to be in Arkansas? Or were you perfectly happy to be traveling with your family?
No, I was just a kid, didn't know any better. I was just a boy, and probably more foolish than most. And I just went along for the ride. When I got older and went to college looking for a job and so on, then I began to recognize how desperately I wished I would have had stronger roots in different places. But that's not what the Lord had for me. I don't mean that as a complaint. It's just a fact. You know, we all get dealt certain hands that are good and bad and so on. But I knew one thing, and I know one thing growing up partially where I did, that America truly is the land of the free. This is the place that everyone wants to be. And the reason is not economic. Certainly it would be for some. But the core values that we have, liberty loving, the worth of the individual, residing in Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman, you name it, Western Civ, it's all real. And Lord bless those people in Jordan and everywhere else. More power to them. But it's not where I want to be, Vance. I want to be in the land of the free.
There's something paradoxical about the situation you described about, seeing gangs of people go out for justice for their daughter, or, I saw it in Africa where I would see people that had been robbed and they thought, hey, let's push back on these thieves. We're going to do it as a collection because there's no police. And then you come to the United States and you say, well, we don't have that. We actually give the monopoly on violence over to the police. But I think that there is something to be said for the sort of relationships that you have, that your kin will come fight for you. Not that I want that in any way at all. I don't want mob justice in the U.S., but it's not by default automatically the best way, right? Like there's something you lose when you don't have your kin come look out for you.
Right. You can feel it. We can talk legalism all day, but you and I know, Vance, that if one of our close cousins, for example, calls us and says, hey, need some help, I'm not going to ask too many questions. I'm going to help him, and it involves what it involves. I'm not saying I'm going to take a body out in the woods and bury it. That's not what I said. But I'm not going to ask too many questions because of the blood. And I believe that most people, or a lot of people, feel that same way, and they understand that primal foot pull. Maybe they can't express it, but it's there.
So when you look back on what you learned about the Arab culture, just that part of the world, and now you see what's going on. You got Israel and their attacks on Palestine, trying to root out Hamas. All the Persian Gulf is still a total mess. We don't allow ships through there anymore. What's your take on what's going on there, and will it ever get cleaned up?
I don't believe so. I believe it's more of the same, my opinion. The whole area is blanketed with Islam, and therefore you have a place that's going to be in constant turmoil and constant dualism from here to eternity. When you're dealing with a religion that can't be reformed, when you're dealing with a religion that has a text that's immutable, right? The Quran's not written, it's uncreated, it just is. When you're dealing with all that, in 2024, the same way you would have been dealing with it in 700 AD, and this is the fruit that it bears. If blessed are the peacemakers, if you can go into Israel right now and get everybody to calm down, hey, more power to it. Do I think there will be any sort of permanent resolution that will change anything? I do not. Look up any Islamic country, they all have the bloody borders, they always will. Internally, far worse, and that is often papered over, of course, by Western money. And in the case of the Emirates, in the case of Saudi, you have a geological accident where it's papered over by oil. But Islam, in my opinion, it is what it is. And anyone who doubts that simply has to go and live or examine their societies and their tenets. I wish, like a lot of people do, I wish I could tell you, hey, man, I believe that all cultures are equal. I don't believe that remotely. I believe that Western cultures have it right, where they recognize the worth of the individual and the rest fall way behind. Just my opinion, but I believe history bears that out. And going forward, I believe it's going to become even clearer, which in some ways seems to be happening. Those values seem to be grinding at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges with thinking about it as Western culture is Western culture contains Christianity, and it has for many, many years, and all of the things that go along with that, the ability to forgive, the push against mob justice, meritocracy somehow fits. It depends. You've actually sent me some books where you see Christianity run amok can be just as much of a prison as anything else. But I don't know that the foundational beliefs in the West that you can continue to point to in being Christian. There are a lot of people that are, I think, moving into a woke ideology, which I think has every single tenet of a religion except for maybe known sacred texts. But they have all these belief systems about, what is right and wrong, who is responsible, what are grievances, these kinds of things. So do you think that Western culture is still a Christian culture?
At its base it is, but if the grind going on right now in the United States, the sparks, literally, figuratively, you certainly can see them. Europe even more advanced than us. In your lifetime, Vance, in my lifetime, the change is apparent. Now, I don't know what direction we will go in the future, but I do know that we are going to go in some direction. And once you begin to move away from the Constitution, as we have, certainly in the last 50 years, certainly since Franklin Roosevelt, certainly since the Great Society in the 1960s, once you begin to push past the Constitution and you begin to go beyond its original meanings, you're in grave danger. And we are now at the point that we can all see that once the Supreme Court, or if the Supreme Court was to get packed, or if it was to lean completely left, you would have a new set of mores, values, and interpretations of the Constitution that would set in, thereby transforming society. We're actually at a point, as we speak, where you've got roughly 50% of the country that simply doesn't pay taxes. We're at a point where if you add government employees and then state employees together, I mean, shoot, is it now 20 million people, something like that. We're at a point where the government departments have bigger budgets and more employees than sometimes anything you could have ever imagined. I'll just use USDA for an example since I write about USDA. I mean, I don't know, it's 100,000 employees, 200 billion budget, something, 150 billion. Then you've got it all repeated, redundant at the state level. Let's do it all again. And then you just extrapolate on out from there across government departments. And then, you know, it's almost farcical to bring up the borders open in the midst of me and you talking right now. The border is open. And I hear all the talk about, hey, Ukrainian foreign aid or the foreign aid to Israel and so on. And there has to be a reckoning. You have to think, I understand giving food aid. I understand giving staples to anyone. But whether it's Ukraine or Israel or who have you, what have you, just handing out boatloads of cash seems to be cutting our own throats. That seems to be, that's just the way I see it. You know, there it is.
When you think about cutting your own throat, I actually got a little pushback on last week's episode from a guy that he thought, hey, you know, the immigration issue that we're having right now, or people coming over the border, you know, we need those people because people in the U.S. are not willing or able to work for the wages that we have. And you think about so we can kind of take that and put it to the side for a second. When somebody tries to explain to me why the Biden administration would want the borders open, the best explanation they can come up with is, well, they're trying to do this so that way they can raise the number of people that are counted in the census, so that way they can get more electoral votes, so that way they can take over. There's something that doesn't seem right about that explanation, because that explanation only takes you so far. Like, I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine somebody saying, I'm going to blow this place up in order that I can reign over hell. Where are you on this one?
You know, frankly, I don't have any problem believing that myself, because some people are happy in hell. Well, we know that. However, I would assume, this is a guess, that they would indeed be trying to boost or manipulate the census. Big business would want a lot of those people to come in. You can change voting demographics for long periods of time. And, you know, a reasonable question for anyone who says that, though, is, okay, well, why don't we just double them? Why don't we just triple them, right? If we really need them, and it's no problem having an open border, why don't we make it wider? You know, why don't we bring in 100 million this year? The question answers itself through its absurdity. Everyone knows you can't bring in 100 million. Everyone knows that even if you bring in only a few million, don't put them in my town, or at least don't put them in my neighborhood, or don't put them in my house. All of this is reasonable. America has long been the most wonderful place to allow legal immigration. And it used to be that we were able to look at even legal immigration and say, hey, need a moratorium here. We've had too many come in at one time. Let's just stop. You can't even do that anymore. And then, you know, Vance, I don't know where your people came from. You don't know where mine came from. But back in the day when they came, there was no government tit. They got here and, hey, you pull yourself up by your bootstrap. You get to work. You can get some charity from private organizations. But if you come here, you give to us, you create a life essentially for your children or for your grandchildren. That's not what I see. I see the same things that everyone else sees. I see people sometimes arriving with designer clothes and cell phones, and some of them, yes, I am somewhat skinny, but some of them look like they have more calories on their bones than I do. This does not accord with what I've seen with political asylum, refugees of the past. It certainly doesn't accord with Ellis Island. And if anybody says that's a biased way to look or a racist way to look, I'd say, look, I mean, let me be very frank. I don't want unbounded numbers of Swedes or Irish coming across the southern border. At the base of the argument, I don't want anyone coming across. That seems very reasonable. It was reasonable to my grandfather and to my forefathers. And I will go far to say that I believe if we could pull James Madison, who wrote the Constitution, up from the grave, I think it would be very reasonable to James Madison as well. And he would say, what have y'all done? What are y'all doing?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems with this border is no matter how you feel about whether or not people should or shouldn't be here, I think, largely the people who listen to this probably say, let's be very careful about how many people we let in. But what are you going to do when you decide that there will eventually be a conflict, right? There's no chance that it won't be. If we continue to live in an inflationary environment where, the amount that it costs to live keeps going up, and then if you start to have unemployment problems, people are going to look around and they're saying, what are these people doing here? And what are you going to do? You're going to round up millions of people and then put them on airplanes, drive them to Mexico? Where are you going to take them? And in what way can you do this that you are not that you're not actually being treated like you're doing some kind of a genocide? Like that you're taking an entire race of people or a country of people and booting them out of your country. I don't know. I see no positive way under which this can resolve itself.
Right.
Unless you have some kind of integration, I guess. But it seems very unlikely to me.
Yeah. If what you described, if that was to go on tomorrow, the media, the legacy media would come unwound and the word would come, as you said, genocide or something along that line. They would screech until it stopped. When you take a country and you bring in a massive amount of people, you're not simply replacing or changing or adding to. It does not work that way culturally. If you were to go into Saudi Arabia right now and you were to pump in a massive amount, let's say 5, 10, 15% to their population of Vietnamese, everyone knows the Saudis would explode. And everyone knows you would not have a mixing and you would not have integration. And everyone knows that there wouldn't be any talk about racism. It would simply be, hey, this is not a good idea. This does not work well with human beings. So the idea that you just come here and dump a bunch of people in without the time that is required to allow the proper blending with all of us, you are putting, you're setting a match to the fuse. And I don't know what's going to happen when it explodes, but I do believe that something is going to happen. It's not just me and my neighbor. It's not just me and the fella at the cafe. It's not just what I read or see online. Everyone knows, everyone can feel that we as a society have at least moved toward the possibility of some degree of civil war. I'm not here to tell you it happens tomorrow. I'm not here to tell you it's going to happen in 50 years. I'm simply saying it's now on the table for the right and for the left. The Civil War breaks out in 1861. Talk of civil war began right after the War of 1812. That's a 50-year span. So could there not be something like that happening before us? I think there very, very well could be. I don't know what the split would be. I don't know if it's Texas in the South. I don't know if it's Texas in the West. I think something will happen, and I don't think that the will of the federal government will be there to stop people from breaking away once it happens, if it happens. Yes, there are far, far smarter minds, including yourself, that know more than I do about that topic. However, I know it's out there on the street. I know the common man talks about it.
Oh, I mean, you and I, well, because Chris and I write back and forth all the time. Chris, we stay in touch. But I about a year ago, I was talking with, I've got a buddy that's just a normie. He's a guy, nothing wrong with him, great guy, cares for his family, has a great corporate job. But when I want to ask him about stuff that I am hearing about, just to see, hey, what do normal people think of? Not the guys that are scouring podcasts and looking through the deep edges of Twitter and finding these kind of edgy things. And I asked him about national divorce, and he was like, no, I think that's the only thing that crazy people talk about. Fast forward 9 months, 10 months, and I asked him again, and he was like, oh yeah, I'm hearing it all over the place. Right. So it has definitely gone down the graph. It is way more inside of the Overton window. It went from being a, certainly an unthinkable idea to now maybe radical to, I would imagine, among some people thinking it's acceptable. And when I think about it, I think how frustrated I get with when Trump was elected, how all of a sudden there was violence everywhere. It was everywhere. There were buildings being burned down. There were people protesting. Now all of a sudden racial tensions got kicked up to another level. It happened in St. Louis. I mean, it was a really intense time. And I sense that will happen again, exactly, if not worse, if Trump were to be elected again. And I think that I'm not the only person that, even if you don't vote for Trump, the idea that the one side would resort to violence when they don't get their way makes me resentful and think, what do we have to do to separate ourselves from these people that are so willing to use violence?
Vance, you're exactly right. We've reached a point where we walk over litmus paper issues every day. So we're at the point where abortion is a breaking issue, right? It's a wedge issue. We're at the point where we don't even, as a country, we can't even define marriage, right? So regardless of your position on gay marriage, tell me beyond that. Is it just 2 people, 3 people? You can see where this goes. You got an erosion of morality. Whether you agree or not, it's changing. We have a big difference on the whole welfare system. We now have the border. We have our views on public education, and there are more and more of these issues, not even to mention the whole debacle of trans and she-males and so on. Where does that all go? I don't see it being papered over. I certainly don't see everybody coming to the table in 5 years and saying, okay, we'll have a sit down, we're able to figure this out. Those seem to be permanent divides. They seem to be chasms. I don't see a solution coming. And regardless of whether someone is a Trump supporter or anti-Trump, even if he was reelected, he's in there for 4 more years. So after 4 years, you're at the same level of discord regarding, are you going to put in another outsider? Are you going to put in another rhino? Or are you going to put in another Democrat? I don't know, Vance. If you'd asked me just a few years ago, I'd have been very sanguine and very hopeful. And Lord, I'm very hopeful. I always maintain hope. But I tell you just what I see. And things do not bode well. Otherwise, I would say different. I'm just glad to write in agriculture. I'm glad to be in farming. I feel like there are the most wonderful people in that work field. And why? I'm not sure. I think maybe because regardless of how well they're doing now, they might just be a single generation removed from an ass whipping that their daddy took or their grandparents took. They're people that recognize often where they came from. So for me to get to write on that, write about that, despite the crazy storm that we're in and is around us right now, it's very, very, very grounding. If you just go back to 1790, we've got roughly 3 million, 4 million people in the country, and 90%, Vance, 90% of those are farmers, right? So that's who we are. So this great experiment of liberty that kicks off in 1776, or arguably before then, but this great experiment of liberty was also an experiment in farming liberty. What happens to a farming society when they are given the most amount of rope in world history? When they exploded, and they did arguably the finest job of agricultural work in world history. But that is who we are, right? So maybe your daddy was not a farmer, but all you got to do is go back down the line, and we all were at some point. 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 10 of those are farmers, 10 more involved in commerce that involves ag trade, and almost everyone in the building has some sort of tangential relationship to farming through a relative. So when they're not talking that summer about liberty and politics and consequences, some of them are literally thinking about their operations. And if you push up 10 years, let's go to 1787 of the Constitutional Convention. I think that's about 55 framers. Once again, you got about 10 farmers, 10 in ag commerce, and the rest attached somehow to farming. And we stay that way. We stay that way until 1920. 1920 is the first ag census. The first census that shows more people living in the city than rural area. So from 1920 all the way back to the late 1700s, we're very, very much a farming society. And you can go to any point in U.S. history, and you can pull on that point. You can unravel the threads, if you like, and you grab any of those threads, and when you pull out farming. You pull out agriculture. I want to go to 1860, but I'll stop right there and get a breath, Vance.
Well, to me, what this reminds me of, so I do these legacy interviews where I record people telling their life stories, and so many of my clients are in ag. And one of the things that I have come to realize is of deep importance is to record these people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, talking about not just how you ran your own family and how you ran your farm, but almost all of these people are connected to their community. And they've figured out, how do you balance the relationship between the freedom of farming and the need to have consensus in the city? And how do you work together, and how do you set up these institutions? So whether it's your grain co-op, your electric co-op, your farm bureau, your like all the different things that were in a community, Rotary clubs and these different organizations, and this social technology that I think farmers essentially invented, which was how to get along in small communities, is being lost. And we don't know actually how to do it. And if you want to go now in the United States and just start a club or start an organization, I would say it would take extreme effort, and probably only most people would fail at trying to get some of the organizations started that ag has had for the last 150 years.
You know, Vance, if let me show you how deep this runs, right? How this connects truly around our heart. Go to 1861, start of the Civil War. We bump up 4 years, April 9th. April 9th, 1865, Appomattox Courthouse. Bobby Lee goes in there, waves a white flag, and signs a surrender. Grant takes it, and the country, at least the North, explodes in celebration. And everyone thinks only good times are ahead. That's April 9th. And as April 9th unfolds, in the days after, John Wilkes Booth is running around in D.C. fixing to unleash hell. And he has 4 targets. Right? He wants to kill Ulysses S. Grant. He wants to kill Andrew Johnson. He wants to kill Secretary of State William Seward. And, of course, he wants to kill Abraham Lincoln. And the great irony here is that John Wilkes Booth is born on a farm. They had a 400, 300-acre operation, sizable at the time. And when he wasn't at the theater as a boy, he's running around oftentimes on his farm. Booth, despite pale skin and soft hands, understood agriculture. And his 4 targets are directly off the farm. Lincoln, the farm boy. Andrew Johnson, he's vice president and has a 400-acre farm back in Tennessee. Secretary of State William Seward grows up on a farm in New York. He's the one that passes gets the Fertilizer Act passed in 1856 to help out farmers. The man understands farming. And then, of course, Ulysses S. Grant, right? Grant is farming, row cropping. up until 1859, up till the eve of the Civil War, he is in the fields. And those are the 4 guys that Booth wants to kill on April 14th, 5 days after the war ends. And he has this group of assassins, and they go to target these men. Grant chooses to leave town. Grant was supposed to be there at Ford's Theater in that box with Lincoln. If I remember right, Grant's wife and Lincoln's wife didn't like each other. I think, not to speak ill of the dead, I don't think most people liked Mary Todd Lincoln. So she talks Ulysses S. Grant into leaving town, his wife, and they do, and probably save their lives. All right. The first person they go after that night is Vice President Andrew Johnson. There's a man named George Atzerodt that's supposed to kill Johnson, who I said has a farm back in Tennessee. The guy chickens out, doesn't even go to Vice President Johnson's room in a hotel, leaves him alone. Johnson doesn't even know till later he was a target. Could have been killed and should have been killed, wasn't killed. The next person that night was Secretary of State William Seward. And Booth sends one of his assassins, or actually a couple, but the man to carry out the assassination is named Lewis Powell. Big, tall, handsome guy. One of the oddest characters in U.S. history. So Powell is a farm boy out of Alabama, right? He's a farm boy out of Alabama and Georgia. Family had farms in both places. Daddy was a preacher farmer. He sent into Seward's house something like later on in the evening with some medicine for Seward, because Seward has had a horse accident and is in the bed with a metal brace on, terribly injured. Powell forces his way into Seward's house, runs up the stairs, is met by Seward's son, cracks Seward's son over the head with a pistol, fractures Seward's son's head, and the pistol breaks. So when he bursts into Secretary of State Seward's room, the pistol is broken. He's forced to pull a knife. He pulls what's essentially a Bowie knife, goes over to the bed and begins to stab. And Seward comes within a hair of a terrible, terrible death. But he has this metal brace on, and Powell can't cut the jugular. So Powell freaks out, can't quite kill him, and runs away. Seward survives that night. Google a picture when you're curious of Secretary of State William Seward, and you'll see him in profile. You'll see him with the collar pulled up high. He's hiding his neck. He's hiding all the wounds on his neck and his jawline. Right. So now at that point, Booth was 0 for 2. If you count Ulysses S. Grant, he's 0 for 3. But Booth himself is going to carry out, of course, the assassination of Lincoln. So when he goes up there with that Derringer, what was it, a 44 Derringer? Anyhow, it was, significant little ball, and puts it into the back of Lincoln's head. There's another guy there in the booth, of course, with his wife who replaced Grant, named Henry Rathbone. He pulls a knife and he slices Rathbone's arm to the artery, severe wound. He kills Lincoln. Lincoln's going to die a day later, of course. He puts the bullet into Lincoln. He cuts Rathbone's arm, and he leaps off down onto the stage, right? The guy he killed there, the guy he injured there, Rathbone, later goes insane and murders his own wife and kids with a knife. I think he used a knife or a gun, I can't remember, and then tried to kill himself. And that's a wild one there, but that's a tangent. Booth jumps out. He runs off into the night, Vance, and then proceeds for the next few days to hide out on farm after farm after farm. So the farm boy Booth, who just assassinated a farm boy, tried to kill a bunch of other farm-related fellows, then runs off and hides in farm after farm after farm in Virginia. They catch him, right? That was April 9th was the end of the war. April 14th was the assassination of Lincoln. April 26th, they catch up to Booth in the middle of the night. He's in a barn. They're under strict orders. Do not kill this fellow Booth, because they knew there was a grand conspiracy, and the Secretary of War wanted his head, and he wanted to question him. One of the fellows that surrounded the barn, they set the barn on fire, and one of the most surreal characters in U.S. history just happens to be outside the barn, armed. He's a soldier. This is a man who's so crazy that he cut off his own testicles, right? This guy cut his own balls off, said he was, I believe he was lusting after prostitutes, something like that, and he cut his own balls off and went to church the same night. That's who we're dealing with. That's who's staring at Booth. He's looking through the cracks of the barn, old ballless Boston Corvette. He's looking through the cracks of the barn. He shoots Booth in the neck. They run in to get Booth. Booth dies on the scene, right? It's total chaos in the United States. That's April 9th. That's April 14th. That's April 26th. On April 27th, the next day, 10, 11 days after the end of the Civil War, you've got guys moving all over the country, right? You had tens of thousands or more of soldiers in the North, soldiers in the South. They're in prisoner of war camps. They have to go home. Vance, you had in the Union, you had 50% of Union soldiers were farm boys, right? 48%, something like that. Very high number. In the South, the number was outrageously high. Like 70% of all fellows in the Army were farm boys. And all of these farm boys are now returning home. But to get the Union soldiers home, out of places like Georgia and Alabama, where most of these prisoner of war camps, they needed the Mississippi River. So they muled them, or they marched them. In a few cases, they took them by train. They took them over to the Mississippi River, and they're sending them north, right, on steamboats. They were paying steamboat captains who normally move farm goods. They were paying them outrageous amounts of money to take officers and farm boy soldiers back home. And they load one up. It becomes notorious in history. It's one of the last ones. It's called the Sultana. And it's built for like 300, 400 men, 260 feet long. They cram almost 2,500 people on there, right? The boat is creaking. The boilers are bad. They send it upriver, and just, I believe, north of Memphis, the boiler explodes in the middle of the night. The ship goes down. 1,200 men either burn or drown, and presumably, right, this is a decent guess of the 1,200, if we go with the 50% mark, up to 500, 600 farm boys then die on the Sultana. That is the worst. That's the number one. That's the worst U.S. maritime disaster in history, right? Titanic was not an American ship, so you can't count that one technically. But that's the worst maritime disaster. The problem is the Sultana occurs on the 27th. Booth was killed on the 26th. So the media, right, everyone in the country did not want to hear about 1,200 deaths, not even on a battlefield, but on the Mississippi River in the cold winter flow. So that one just got pushed off the scene. But that's from April 9th to April 27th, Vance. That's one tiny thread. There are millions of those threads to pull to show the wondrous, deep grip that America has, or agriculture has on America. Sorry, I get excited about that. I can't help it.
Oh, man. I think you should have been a U.S. history teacher, because we start talking and you start telling me things that are shocking to me. I'm willing to admit my own ignorance here, which is I had no idea how close to the end of the Civil War that John Wilkes Booth killed Abraham Lincoln. Those two things were separated in my mind to a large extent, that they were much further apart. I really didn't know that there was a conspiracy on 4 people. I remember there being a movie kind of about it, but I didn't really check it out. And then to the loss of life on this maritime, I've never heard that story. These are all those things that, it's certainly in my 40s, it's on me to go through and do my own history reading, but I definitely feel like I am wanting when it comes to knowledge of U.S. history.
Vance, when you get a chance, anybody listening, Google Lewis Powell. He's the guy that Booth sent to kill Secretary of State William Seward. He's a uniquely handsome fella. He was a tall fella, very odd-looking, remarkable photos of him before he was executed. They took him and I believe 3 of the other conspirators, and they hung all of them. And when they did so, the hangman, the executioner, got it right on everyone except for Powell. He was tall. And when the rope dropped on him, I think the rope was too short. And so he ended up dangling and kicking for, I believe, something like 5 whole minutes. It's very, very well documented. And I think it was only a few years ago that the Smithsonian, there was some museum just a few years ago in the 90s, found his skull. His skull had been taken there. They found it. I think he's finally put to rest somewhere down in Florida. Wild stories. This country has more nuts and kooks running around in it today and in its history, surely than any place on earth. And man, I guess I'm one of them. Look.
Oh man, you unearthed some of the craziest things. People out there, people willing to fight with the government, even though it looks totally helpless. We'll go to some of those stories in just a second, but one of the things that I'm worried about, is as worried as you can be about an amorphous event that could happen, but I think it's very possible, is we have watched the Ukraine war have this massive increase in the amount of drones that are being used, and not just drones where somebody's flying that drone back in their little cockpit back in headquarters, but like now some of these are autonomous. And to me, this is a dangerous omen, because drones are going to be able to be used in political assassinations, and people that in the past would have been very well protected may not be. And I think about the amount of chaos that can add into the system. It's striking. What do you think happens if the U.S. experiences a major assassination on our own soil?
Right. It's going to happen. I certainly would pray that it doesn't happen to President Biden or President Trump or any president. But I can say with conviction, based on past history, based on Mr. Garfield, based on the attempts on Mr. Roosevelt, certainly Lincoln, Kennedy, others, McKinley, it's going to happen again. And what you say about drones, it should be put in stone or on a flag somewhere, because you're exactly right. And I'll add something to that by saying, at the rate of drone technology, at the rate of all of this extreme artificial intelligence technology, I would assume that eventually, not too long from now, a drone will be entirely invisible. In other words, so small that you can't see it. Maybe it's a drone that's small enough to carry some sort of launching device, maybe even a single bullet. The point would be that the technology is there. I'm sure they already have them, but to carry out an assassination of sort at a public event, surely is already being discussed by different groups, by our own government. There's nothing I put past them. I mean, I don't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was, acting. Let me put it this way: when he said I'm a patsy, I believe him.
Well, you talk to people all the time that are no patsies, because they get into a fight with the government who they find trespassing on their land or trying to take something from them. And you really highlight their stories. I think it's actually a noble pursuit that you're doing, because otherwise a lot of these guys' stories would be something just told inside their own families or something. But what's the big ones you've been coming up with lately?
So I hope Tucker Carlson, I hope someone with a very big stage, very big audience out there takes this one and runs with it, because it's crucial for this country. And it is open fields. Now in 4 states, right? Now in 4 states. I just published an article this morning on what's going on in Louisiana. Now you've got Louisiana, you got Tennessee, you got Virginia, and you got Pennsylvania. They are all either appealing or directly involved now in open fields litigation. And essentially that means whether or not the government has access to your private land. And when I say government, I'm talking about either the state level government or the federal government, or both. According to the Supreme Court, as we sit here, Vance, according to the Supreme Court, according to government, they claim the right, a total right, a blanket right of access to your private land. Yes, the Fourth Amendment is there. They acknowledge that on your house, on the immediate area around your house. Once you get past that, whether it's whether you own 1,000 acres or 4 acres or 100,000 acres, the government has complete access to that. Now, there are some exceptions. Mississippi, Montana, South Dakota, several other states, about 8 states have laws whereby the state constitution protects your land. But that state constitution only prevents state officials from going onto your land. Federal officials, the ones out of D.C., still have complete access to your ground. Now, what does that mean? That means that they can come on, right? They can come onto your ground at will. So it doesn't have to be, I'm not talking about game wardens. Certainly it could be a game warden, but it could be an official of any kind from the government. The government, Supreme Court, they don't define it. So they can come on your ground. They can come as long as they want. They don't have to announce themselves. They don't have to have a search warrant. They don't have to have probable cause. They don't even have to have reasonable suspicion. They can come on, stay as long as they want. They can behave as they want, any kind of activity. They could take a soil sample, for example. They could put a camera up. They could put a movie camera up. They could put up different sorts of surveillance or sensor technology, right? Open-ended access. Now, as I said, that's being challenged in 4 states right now. Maybe one of those cases is going to wind up back again at the Supreme Court. Supreme Court made the decisions regarding what's called open fields doctrine, allowing the government onto your land in 1924 and in 1984. Since then, we haven't had a decision on it, but it strikes at the core. It strikes at the core of who we are as Americans, what we believe about the Constitution. And again, I take it right back to our forefathers. If you brought our framers into the room and told our framers, hey, the government claims that they have complete carte blanche to come onto my property and they can surveil me anytime they want, I believe the framers would throw up a red flag immediately. I believe the framers would look around and ask, is this a joke? So, Vance, when I've done these stories and talked to different state organizations, I've asked them a simple question, like departments of conservation. Okay, tell me what your policy is, right? Tell me if one of your officials goes onto Vance Crowe's land, does he have to record it? Does he have to tell his boss? If he puts a camera up on Vance Crowe's land, if he catches any female relative of Vance's, right, going to the bathroom, for example, who gets access to those pictures? Who is allowed to see that? There is a Pandora's box of questions out there no one will answer.
Do they not answer? Do they just tell you no comment? What do they?
They do not answer, period. They don't even they don't even accept the questions and respond to them. Now, FOIA, right, Freedom of Information Act, and say, how many cameras nationwide does Fish and Wildlife or DOJ have on private land that are warrantless? All right. And yes. I've tried that. Others have tried that. You can imagine the level of success with that. So that's where we're at, right? And the big shame here. The big shame is that this should be a story or a series of stories on the cover of Time or Newsweek, New York Times. You figure, hey, somebody run with this. They don't run with it, Vance, because I believe, again, at their core, I believe they support government's ability to go in when government, needs to, if you'll allow me to say that.
You and I have spoken about this concept of curtilage and, what is your property and what can the government go on? And it's just so astounding that anyone outside of the guy that gets to walk on your property would ever advocate for this. Why in the world would you want the government to do that? But I'm guessing if you're, I try not to distill things down into dichotomies, but I think even more than we have a blue-red problem in this country or division in this country, we have a rural-urban division in this country, and it's not so perfectly rural and urban that if you're living in, Chesterfield, Missouri, you're against the rural people. I don't think it's quite like that, but there's certainly this belief of people living in large cities that the people living in the countryside are slow. They have all kinds of backwards ideas that we need to get rid of. They have all these, they have ill intents. And I could imagine that somebody living in the city could say, well, if you have 400 acres, we need to make sure you're not poaching and killing, special eagles or protected species or something. But outside of that, why in the world would anyone want to advocate that the government be able to do this?
Absolutely. It's a lot different, Vance, if you live in a suburb and have a half acre behind your house, as opposed to if you're out in the country with a house and 10 acres or 100 acres, or possibly much more. And it also gets down to, who's armed out there, who's not armed out there, who's packing, who's not. You're right. There's a dichotomy between city and country, and someone could argue very reasonably and say there has always been such a split, but I think the split now is deeper than ever, partially, in my opinion, based on those litmus paper tests of what do you believe about X, Y, and Z, where we seem to be on two opposite sides of a canyon. And you can only talk so much. You can only compromise so much. If you're truly standing on opposite edges of something wide, you can only put on for so long. So where do we go from here? I have kids, Vance, and you have kids, so I never want to take the approach of, hey, I just, piss on all of them and we'll go do our thing. That's not what my forefathers did. That's not what the boys and girls did in 1776. They stood for something and they spoke out. So for the sake of my kids, for the sake of my country coming to be, I'm not going to disband or walk away from politics. I don't know who it was. Was it Pericles, that said, you can pretend that you're not interested in politics, but let me tell you, politics is interested in you. And it may not have been Pericles, and please excuse me if it was someone else, but I think it might have been. Anyhow, let's attribute it to him now. Or we could just make something up and say, hey man, that's what Napoleon said.
So Chris, you've been following a lot of stuff of government intrusion, and making sure people are in ag. A lot of your stories are about people doing swindles. They're great stories about people pulling some pranks on either unsuspecting victims or using government systems to run up their own the amount of money they're making. What's a big story you have coming down the pipe that we can be looking forward to?
I just finished last month a very big one on Roger Reeves. And Vance, that was the one on Pablo Escobar's pilot. And he's the most prolific drug pilot probably in history. He grew up on a farm in Georgia. I grew up as poor can be. And yet he ascended to incredible heights of wealth. And then he crashed, spent 33 years in prison. He's out now, and he's telling his story. I think that one of the big TV companies, Apple or someone, has bought his TV rights. They're going to turn him into a movie. Yeah, incredible story. If anybody wants to Google Roger Reeves to what I wrote or somebody else wrote, I assure you, there are many crazy tales out there. There's only one tale of Roger Reeves. But upcoming, I've got one, Vance, on Buddy Holly and the land where he crashed in 1959. As you know, he crashed with Richie Valens. We crashed with Big Bopper. We crashed in a field, Iowa cornfield. And so I interviewed that farmer who owns the land today. He worked on that land when he was a child, never even knew that is where Buddy Holly crashed. And once you start to peel back the layers on the Buddy Holly story, it connects directly, of course, not just with Waylon Jennings. It also attaches itself to Bob Dylan and to Clapton and to the Beatles and to others, even Elvis. Very, very, very poignant tale. Very, who was this guy going to be? He was going to be an absolute Mount Rushmore figure, except for falling out of the sky that night. But anyway, I think it will, once it's actually published, it's going to be a good one.
It's funny you mentioned that story because I just gave a talk at an organization called the Ag Ventures Alliance in Clear Lake, and it was actually at the bandstand location that he had his last show before he got on that plane in Clear Lake and then crashed. That just 2 weeks ago.
Were you at the Surf Ballroom?
Yeah, that's right. The Surf Ballroom. That's right.
Wow, man!
It's an incredible location. Iowa's littered with all these great little places where bands used to play. It looks like a gymnasium, and that one they've kept very well preserved. But that's amazing, the synchronicity there.
Vance, when they left that night, they left by vehicle to drive to the airport. Everybody else got on the bus. But the three of them, and the pilot, of course, who was waiting in the airplane, they were waiting behind the Surf Ballroom. And Richie Valens, old Mr. La Bamba, was the last one out of the building. And Buddy Holly sent one of the guys in the car inside to get their road crew. Some of their equipment, because they didn't have a road crew. And when he went in, Richie Valens was in the building signing that last autograph. And Valens sees him. He sees him come in and says, hey, man, can I please have a seat on that plane? The guy says, no, man, there's no more seats. This is the last seat. And Valens says, please, can I have that seat on the plane? I'll flip you for it. He pulled out a 50-cent piece. They flipped right there. Valens wins, walks out the door, gets in the car with Buddy Holly and them. You can imagine they're chuckling, they're laughing, they're young guys, they're telling jokes, and they're dead minutes later. Quite unusual. But I've got another one coming, Vance, in the next few months. The story's done. I've just got to publish on a major ag scam, Ponzi scam out of the Midwest, where some old school kind of evangelistic grifters used fish and quail eggs and aquaponics and fake stock and ran a wondrous scheme that took, unfortunately, a huge amount of farmers for, I think, maybe 4 or 5 different states. They said that they had a contract to sell the fish to Dubai. Dubai and Abu Dhabi were going to send in planes to pick up the fish in Oklahoma. Then they had a contract with Carnival Cruise Line to sell their quail eggs for their buffets. And it was all, hey, it's all good. Bob's your uncle. And of course, once it got cranked up and you paid your money in, boom, that they were gone. You never saw them again. So I finally got that one done, and it's going to be kind of buck wild, man. It's then I've always got a few crazy. I'll tell you one, Vance. It's coming very soon, probably next week. I've got one out on the amount of people killed in the last 20 years by wild pigs. I'm talking about fatal attacks. The numbers will blow you away because most of the fatalities occur in foreign countries, China and India. But they certainly do occur here in the United States, but there's only been, I think, less than 10 recorded wild pig caused deaths in the last 100 years in the United States. But the kicker is that the last one in the U.S. was in Texas in 2019. That's only 5 years ago. And it is arguably the most gruesome wild pig attack documented on a human being, possibly in history. And a poor lady, she was almost 60, maybe 59, was getting out of her vehicle one morning, 6 a.m., 6:30 a.m., out in a rural part of Chambers County, Texas. And she was hit by a sounder of pigs. And she bled to death. They ate her alive. They consumed roughly a third of her legs. And she was covered head to toe in wounds. And people didn't even accept at first that it was hogs because it hadn't been filmed. But when they did the autopsy, when the pathology reports came in, they even did, I believe they did DNA also. You know, she was riddled. She was riddled with puncture wounds and bites and so on. Because a lot of the time, Vance, what these hogs do, at least the males, right? The males, the women, the females and the males, they both have tusks, but the male's tusks come up, let's say, 3 to 4 inches off the jawline, far deeper in the jaw. The female's tusks just barely come up beyond that. So in other words, the females can't stab as well as the males. But the end of a tusk, if I were just to pull a tusk off of a hog and hand it to you, you'll note that the end of it is hard. The very end is hard, almost like a nail. And once you get past that, on the side of the bottom tusks, they are sharp as razors. So that hog, what he'll do is come in and puncture with that lower tusk hook, right? And then he'll pull back. And if he was to come up on you, let's say he's a 250, 300-pound hog, Vance, and he meets you, an adult, he's going to be roughly at your growing level. And because he's at that growing level, your femoral artery is often exposed in these tacks. So a lot of the times, that boar's going to hook right there at the femoral artery. There was a American farmer, a Mississippi guy, roughly 1920, that was out, and he got hooked, femoral artery severed. He died in less than 5 minutes right there in front of his boys. I think the family still has the rag that they tried to use as a tourniquet on him, and they still have one of the tusks from the hog that actually did the killing. But that story, I'm going to publish it in a few months. It also tore my heart out because I could not get over imagining seeing his boys, who I believe were something like 16 and 19 at the time, watching Daddy bleed out and fade out on the ground. They couldn't even get him back. They couldn't even get him back to the house. Anyway, sorry for the long-winded answer, but yeah, that's what's going on.
Well, Chris Bennett, I know we'll probably have you on before then, but I'm definitely having you on for this year's Halloween episode. We'll have you come on and talk about gore and all these sorts of things. But thank you so much for coming on, chatting. If people wanted to read your stuff, chat more about you, they have a story they think you ought to help them tell, where should they go?
Hey, please look me up online. Just put my name in, put Farm Journal. My email address is cbennett, CBENNETT @farmjournal.com, or they can call my cell. It's all there. 662-592-1106. I'm not on the traditional social medias. Maybe I should be. Maybe I will get on there. But holler at me and I'll holler back. And Vance, it's an absolute privilege to be on here with you, Vance Crowe. Nobody does it like Vance Crowe, and he just happens to be blessed with the best name in all of audio, visual, whatever. In fact, I'm going to publicly ask now if I can trade names with you.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on. I absolutely love it. Thank you.